Hi, I'm Chris Germer, and thanks for your interest in this topic. For the next 25 minutes, I'll make a case for self-compassion as an antidote to shame. And then after that, I'd like to offer a 15-minute practice to give you a felt sense of everything I'm about to say. So for starters, self-compassion. Most of you probably already know a lot about self-compassion. However, it was not always like that. Back in 2003, Kristen Neff published the Self-Compassion Scale. And her article was the only scientific article on self-compassion in the peer-reviewed psychological literature at that time. And now there are over 3,000 articles on the subject. So there's a lot of interest in self-compassion, mostly coming at the heels of mindfulness. My own introduction to self-compassion was personal, through the doorway of shame. I'm a clinical psychologist with a specialization in anxiety disorders. I suffered for 20 years from public speaking anxiety, and nothing in my clinical toolbox could fix it. I tried everything. Mindfulness meditation and exposure and beta blockers and cognitive restructuring, nothing helped. Until I learned loving kindness meditation for myself. In other words, just repeating phrases like, may I be safe, may I be peaceful, may I be healthy, may I live with ease. So prior to that, I'd actually been meditating for at least 30 years, but never explicitly and repeatedly offering kindness to myself. And then after I started doing that, 4 months later, I attended a big conference at Harvard Medical School. And when I got up on stage to speak, for the first time in my adult life, the anxiety just disappeared. And this was an amazing experience for me and also a revelation. So I learned a bunch of things. One important thing that I discovered at the time was that my anxiety disorder was actually not an anxiety disorder at all. It was a shame disorder. So all my efforts to manage or to accept anxiety really didn't work because anxiety wasn't the problem. Underlying shame wasn't the problem, and I wasn't touching it. And you can imagine, I used to get up on stage and talk about mindfulness, but I was, so nervous I could hardly get out a word. And that would, needless to say, get me to think, or at least to worry, that the audience would think that I was incompetent, that I was fraudulent, maybe a little stupid. So these are all symptoms of shame. But I wasn't able to address it throughout that whole time. But loving kindness meditation actually gave me the love and acceptance that I so desperately craved or needed, particularly when I was getting up on stage, despite being a flawed human being, despite having anxiety. And it also showed me what I'd been avoiding so long, namely shame. And also, interestingly, self-compassion started to address my shame even before I knew I had shame. In other words, it was only when I had the resource of self-compassion that I was actually even able to see shame. And I also discovered at the time that when we're in the grip of intense and disturbing emotions, like shame, sometimes we need to hold ourselves first before we can hold our experience. So that's actually the subtle difference between mindfulness and self-compassion. Mindfulness is loving awareness of moment-to-moment experience, and self-compassion is loving awareness of the experiencer, the sense of self. And so we all know when somebody else is upset that first we have to pay attention to them until they can calm down enough to be able to address the issue. Same thing with us. So together, mindfulness and self-compassion are a powerful combination for managing difficult emotions. What is self-compassion? First of all, I think self-compassion is a rather unfortunate term. Some people like to use the word inner compassion. And it's unfortunate because many people, when they think of self-compassion, they associate self with selfishness and compassion with weakness. But the research really shows quite the opposite. People who are high in self-compassion are less self-absorbed and narcissistic than people who are low in self-compassion. They're generally more emotionally resilient, in other words, not weak, more motivated to achieve their goals, generally happier and healthier mentally and physically. And also self-compassionate people tend to have more compassionate, satisfying relationships with others. So it's really got nothing to do with selfishness or weakness. What does self-compassion mean? An informal definition of self-compassion is when we suffer, treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding as we would treat a dear friend. And this is actually a radical act. Research by Kristen Neff shows that 68% of us are actually more compassionate to others than to ourselves. Only 6% of people are actually more compassionate to themselves than others, and the remaining 16% are about even. Self-compassion is also a humble enterprise. We're really just including ourselves in the circle of compassion. We are not systematically excluding ourselves. And this has enormous ramifications in terms of health and well-being, and not just for us, but also for others, as I mentioned. When Kristen developed the scale, her formal definition of self-compassion had three components: mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness. So to be self-compassionate, we need to, number one, know we're struggling while we're struggling with some measure of acceptance. That's mindfulness. We can't be compassionate if we don't know we're struggling, right? Part two, component two, is we need to feel kinship with others in the midst of our suffering. In other words, to see our suffering as part of the human experience rather than isolating us. And we also need to have a warm and kind attitude toward ourselves. And this is the self-kindness aspect. So we need all three components to have self-compassion. In Kristen's model, the opposite of mindfulness is self-absorption or or over-identification or rumination. That's the opposite of mindfulness. The opposite of common humanity is isolation and loneliness. And the opposite of self-kindness is self-criticism or self-doubt. What's interesting is that in 2003, when Kristen developed this model, she wasn't aware that self-absorption, isolation, and self-criticism are actually key features of shame. But they are. So theoretically, self-compassion is the opposite of shame. And the research also bears this out. That is to say, whenever scores on the self-compassion scale increase, scores on shame scales decrease. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've always been interested in shame, and particularly the shame side of self-compassion, because shame is associated with just about every psychological disorder, including anxiety, depression, substance abuse, eating disorders, personality disorders, relational conflict. If shame doesn't cause the problem, shame is often a result of the psychological condition because of the role of stigma. Anyhow, right now I'm writing a book on self-compassion and shame 15 years after discovering the power of self-compassion to alleviate my own shame fear-based public speaking anxiety. So what's shame? So in a nutshell, shame is a self-conscious emotion with negative self-evaluation. So shame means I'm imagining in my mind what you are imagining about me, and it's not good. So shame can be considered scorn in the eyes of another. And when we feel shame, there's always an attack on the sense of self. So, for example, there's a difference between guilt and shame, which most people are aware of. Guilt means I did something wrong, and shame means I am wrong. Guilt means I made a mistake. Shame means I am a mistake. So there's an attack on the self. But shame is way more common than we think. So, for example, if you want to wake up in the morning at 6:30 a.m. and you sleep till 8, when you wake up, you might think, oh gosh, I'm such a lazy person. Or if you forgot your sister's birthday, you might think, what kind of a sister am I? So these are all attacks on the self. Or if you drove by a tennis court and had the thought, I could never play tennis, I'm too uncoordinated. In those moments, you would actually be unwittingly shaming yourself. How often does this go on in our minds in the course of a day? Frequently. So human beings are actually hardwired to feel shame. Shame served the purpose of keeping the tribe together during our evolution by making it extremely painful when we violated group norms. The tribe needed to stick together for survival. And it hurts, shame hurts really badly, emotionally, but when we break the rules. But this actually meant that we would stop doing what we were doing, and that it wasn't the tribe didn't have to hurt us physically in order to bring us back into line. We were already hurting emotionally when it was clear that we broke the rules. So it has a evolutionary function. Most shame actually comes and goes rather quickly, especially when our tribe welcomes us back into the fold. However, when we refer to shame nowadays, we're really not talking about this kind of adaptive shame that makes us stop and then review what just happened. We're talking about the shame that we carry with us everywhere we go. And that's what's known as trait shame rather than state shame. It's in us. So you can say that we're all born with the capacity for shame, but we are not born feeling shame all the time. That kind of shame results from how we have been treated by others, and it is not our fault. Interestingly, research shows that shame is less about doing something wrong than about being devalued by others, even when we did nothing wrong. So, for example, we can feel shame because of how we're treated, even if we did nothing wrong. And when we are treated badly by others, we internalize those attitudes, and then we feel badly about ourselves. So we can be mistreated by people in our own families, for example, in childhood. We can be mistreated by others outside the family, people whom we know. And we can also be treated badly by the cultural oppression based on our identities, such as race, ethnicity, ability, financial status, gender identity, age, sexual orientation. No fault of our own. But if the culture devalues, demeans, and degrades us, that gets inside of us and causes shame. Fortunately, we can connect with a collective or with supportive people, and we can actually dismantle shame. Interestingly, though, even when shame results from our own actions, it should not be a life sentence. We shouldn't have to carry this around with us for the rest of our lives, because our mistakes are really a product of a vast multiplicity of conditions that are beyond our control, such as our personal history, our emotional triggers, whatever is going on at the moment, maybe what we had for breakfast. Yeah. So we could say that the only true cause of anything is the universe of interacting causes, and that is not under our control. Stuff happens. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, gee, I'd like to do something today that's going to make me feel shame for the rest of my life. Stuff happens in us and through us. We have some control, but not as much as we think. So therefore, we need to find a way of eventually forgiving ourselves for our mistakes. In the words of the eminent psychologist Paul Gilbert in the UK, shame is not our fault, but it is our responsibility. Once we feel shame, hopefully we can learn to behave in a way that doesn't cause additional harm to ourselves and to others. In other words, to learn how to work with shame, to keep shame from perpetuating itself. And shame can cripple us. For example, the shame that results from severe childhood abuse and trauma. What makes trauma become post-traumatic stress disorder is largely the shame aspect. We remove the shame aspect by increasing the self-compassion aspect, and then we're much less likely to have post-traumatic stress. And shame can also hold us back in subtle ways. For example, if we don't speak up as we should, or maybe if we work too hard to prove our self-worth because we don't actually feel as much self-worth, that's the work of shame. Or maybe we're angrier than we should be. Everything is perceived as kind of a threat to our self-esteem because our self-esteem isn't strong, right? Because shame is tearing it down. So these are subtle ways that shame influences our lives. And also in the workplace, shame can hold us back. Shame reduces our motivation. People who are high in self-compassion are more motivated to achieve their goals. It reduces our motivation. It decreases our authenticity, right? When we feel shame, we don't trust ourselves. It robs us of self-confidence. It makes it harder to face our mistakes. If a mistake is a critique of who we are as a person, harder to face. And then we can't learn from them. Shame also makes us self-absorbed. We're thinking about ourselves when we are being attacked, right? Even if it's from within. It also makes us less creative, and it can lead to all kinds of unhelpful behaviors at the workplace, such as isolating ourselves or being overly compliant or aggression, which is not good for anybody. So mindfulness of shame is actually the first step to alleviating shame. Mindfulness is, as I said, knowing what we're experiencing while we're experiencing it with acceptance. Unfortunately, it's not a given that we recognize shame, especially while it's happening within us. Shame is mostly invisible. And it certainly was for me during those decades of public speaking anxiety. I was only looking at anxiety. I couldn't see the shame. I didn't have the strength to face the shame. It was invisible. So, but it's actually it's not that shame cannot be seen. It's that we don't want to see it. It's just too painful. Denial is a intimate part of the shame experience. We also don't want to talk about shame. It's hard to say that makes me feel ashamed. But when a person can say, I feel shame or I'm feeling ashamed, shame has actually already started to loosen its grip. It's a hard thing to say, but it's a powerful thing to say to alleviate shame. So another reason why shame is invisible is because shame wipes out the observer. The part of us that needs to be engaged in order to see and work with shame. It's an attack on the self, and it makes the self go small, go silent, go away. Just makes us want to disappear or slip into the earth, And And when shame is severe, it also leads to dissociation, which is the experience of leaving our bodies, checking out so that we don't need to feel what we're feeling. This is all the work of shame. And sometimes, in order to avoid our shame, to check out, we engage in dubious behaviors, such as getting angry at others because the self-blame is so intense. It's actually relief to get angry at others when we have shame. Or numbing our feelings with, for example, by working excessively or binging on food or alcohol. Also by throwing ourselves into risky behaviors, which is like distracts us from how we feel. So all of this makes us not present. Check out. We can't work with shame if we're not there. And a lot of these behaviors, they even lead to more shame. So for example, drinking to not feel shame, then we feel shame about drinking, right? These various forms of avoidance may actually feel better in the moment, but they actually make shame last longer. The principle is what we resist persists. But here's the good news. Avoiding shame is actually more of a problem than shame itself. Avoiding shame is more of a problem than shame itself. And when we stop avoiding shame, in other words, when we can mindfully see it, recognize it, make some space for it, and when we can meet shame and ourselves with kindness, shame then begins to recede. So therefore, it's good to recognize when we're feeling shame. So how do you know when you are feeling shame? For example, what happens internally? What do you feel when you feel shame? So just think for a moment. Internally, how do you know it? Because we do know it, don't we? When we want to know it. So there might be a sinking feeling. There might be a sense of like being punched in the gut. Sometimes there's tightness in the throat or the chest. Sometimes there's a sense of hollowness or emptiness in the head region. Oftentimes there's flushing or in the face or tension, or your skin crawls or you feel nauseous. These are internal ways of feeling shame, like, ugh. Right? And then also shame has external physical manifestations. So for example, one of the most common expressions is a kind of slumped shoulders, averted gaze, muted speech. Maybe there's some fidgeting. Sometimes people are absolutely still, sort of frozen, swallowing hard. So these are ways that we can actually see when other people are feeling shame, but we can also notice in ourselves. And then also there are mental manifestations of shame. So what goes on in your mind when you're feeling shame? This is good to know, because if you can name shame, you're on the path to alleviating it. What goes on in your mind? So you may notice you're being self-critical. Like I was saying, I could never play tennis, I'm too uncoordinated. Could we recognize that kind of criticism? That's shaming. So there's self-criticism, maybe a sense of inadequacy, like I'm not good enough. Mentally, there's often confusion, like what? Or powerlessness, vulnerability. That's so common with shame. We feel profoundly vulnerable, naked, just like Adam and Eve, naked. Mistrust, sense of unworthiness, incompetence. Another thing the mind does, as I mentioned before, is rumination and self-absorption. Actually, it's interesting. When people are feeling guilty, they're actually less self-absorbed and they're more likely to be able to repair a relationship if they cause somebody harm. When people are ashamed, they're just self-absorbed and they're actually less likely to do anything about it, to fix it. So most of this kind of trait shame is actually not good for social relations. So this is what goes on in us. We start to ruminate, become self-absorbed. So the amazing thing about shame is that shame, after all this said, is mostly an illusion. It's an illusion. Shame feels really terrible. It can ruin our lives. It can ruin other people's lives. This is definitely a fact. But like in the film The Wizard of Oz, when we pull back the curtain on shame, when Toto pulled back the curtain on the wizard, what was left? There was a benign showman holding a few levers, So shame is like that. When we pull back the curtain of shame, when we see it through new eyes, the terrifying aspect actually withers away. So what do we find when we look more closely at shame, especially through the eyes of self-compassion? What does shame look like? So we discover that there are actually three paradoxes about shame, three insights. There's an illusion and there's an insight. So the first is that shame feels blameworthy, but it's actually an innocent emotion that calls for kindness. Shame, an innocent emotion. It's innocent because it arises from the wish to be loved. The energy of shame is the wish to be loved. It is innocent. The second insight is that although shame feels isolating, it's actually a universal emotion. Everybody knows what shame is. It's universal. It actually connects us when we remind ourselves. And the third insight is that shame feels permanent and all-encompassing. It's like this is like who I really am. It feels like this is some truth about us. It feels all-encompassing. It feels permanent, but it's just an emotion. Shame is just an emotion. It's a temporary emotion. We don't always feel shame. It's a temporary emotion, and it only represents a burden that part of us is carrying. It is not who we are. So these are three insights through the eyes of self-compassion. These insights correspond to the three components of self-compassion, namely self-kindness, the one about it feels blameworthy, but it's innocent emotion, self-kindness. Second, common humanity. And third, mindfulness. And we can, when we discover these insights, in other words, not just intellectually, but feel them in our own direct experience, shame can never be quite the same again. We actually pierce the illusion. So what I'd like to do now is just to speak about the first illusion, and that is that shame feels blameworthy, but it's an innocent emotion that calls for kindness. And then after that, we'll do an exercise, the self-compassion break for shame, which will give you a direct experience of all three paradoxes, of all three insights, and how self-compassion can help. Okay? So the first insight, when we use the word innocent, when I say that it feels blameworthy, but it's an innocent emotion, we are not denying that shame can have tragic consequences. We're simply suggesting that shame arises from the universal wish to be loved. So reclaiming the wish to be loved is the first and most courageous act of many people on the path to self-compassion. And it can also, by the way, kick up a lot of difficult emotions. But the innocence of the wish to be loved also makes self-compassion more accessible. So it's so much easier to feel compassion for innocent beings. Easily we feel compassion for children, pets, dolphins, including ourselves when we connect with our innocence. So some people don't like the idea of the wish to be loved. Maybe they prefer the need to belong or the need to be appreciated, to be respected, to be included, to be connected. So this is all fine. You can use whatever language feels right. Just the other day, I saw a brand new study that showed that children as young as 3 years old will override their own preferences in terms of what activities they're doing in order to follow the norms of a group. So already at 3 years old, children are behaving like others. They want to follow the rules. This is instinctive in us through evolution. I like personally the phrase "the wish to be loved" because it captures a deep, primordial, vulnerable need that we have. And actually, to heal shame, we need to go to this vulnerable place. In other words, out of the conceptual and into the visceral. And we are all born with the wish to be loved. So infants are incapable of doing much for themselves. We know this. When an infant is born, it can't do anything. It needs to be fed. It needs to be touched. It needs to be kept warm, food, clothing, shelter, touch. It needs everything. So how does an infant get its needs met? It's really quite simple. An infant gets somebody to love the child, to love it. And then everything flows naturally. Parents often throw themselves in front of a bus in order to protect their child, give their child what they need. Not always, of course. You know, some parents are not very good parents at all. But that's how children survive. They have others take care of them. So with their first breath, not only are they inhaling in order to make the body survive, but they also have a wish, and that is, love me. Okay? And this wish, love me, is well known. Daniel Ladinsky wrote a poem based on the poetry of Hafez, a 14th century Persian mystic. And the poem is called With That Sweet Moon Language. And it goes like this: admit something. Everyone you meet, you say to them, love me. Of course, you don't do this out loud, or someone would call the cops. Still, though, think about it, this great pull in us to connect. Why not be the one who lives with a full moon in each eye that is always saying, with that sweet moon language, what every other eye in this world is dying to hear? Admit something. Everyone you meet, you say to them, love me. Anyhow, most of us have forgotten this. This is true, isn't it? But most of us have forgotten this universal wish to be loved that is beating in our hearts at this time. In fact, in this moment, as you're looking at me in the screen, you're hearing all about shame and self-compassion. Do you see in my eyes the wish to be loved? It's there. Can you see it in your own eyes? You know? So all of us have forgotten. And why have we forgotten? We've forgotten because it hasn't worked, right? We've been hurt. We've reached so many times. We've reached out to people, intimate people, more distant people, to be loved just as we are, and it didn't work. So we kind of had to forget. If we continued to seek to be loved in every interaction consciously, we would be wounded over and over again. So we've actually sort of started to specialize. I'll be like strong or intelligent or charming or who knows what in order to be loved, right? We're not open for this all the time, but still we wish it. And what would it be like if we remembered this wish to be loved? In other words, what if you woke up in the morning, put your hand over your heart and said to yourself something like, just as all beings wish to be loved, so do I, too, now and throughout the day, wish to be loved. What it would be like if in your mindset you knew this? And then you walked out into the kitchen, you saw your children or your spouse, or you walked down the street, you saw a stranger, and you knew that you wish to be loved. What would you see? So inevitably, you would also see that person also wishes to be loved. And when you see that in other people, would it change your relationship to another person? Definitely. You would feel much closer at a vulnerable level, not so afraid. This is an amazing insight. This is part of who we are, but we have long forgotten. What does this have to do with shame? Well, shame is the belief that something is wrong with us that renders us unlovable, unworthy, too flawed to be accepted just as we are. That's shame. And when we look deeply at the nature of shame, we can see that we would never feel shame if we didn't wish to be loved. So shame is that the wish to be loved is the energy that sustains shame. If you didn't wish to be loved, you wouldn't care what other people were thinking about you. You would have no shame. So it's this energy, this primordial wish to be loved that actually sustains shame. So here's the deal. Shame and the wish to be loved are like two sides of the same coin. One side is shame, the other side is the wish to be loved. And when we turn over, in the midst of shame, if we can turn over the coin and see the wish to be loved, if you notice when you're feeling shame, gripped with shame, and you can recognize, I wouldn't feel like this unless I wish to be loved. When you can see that, in that moment, you will start to slip through the web of shame, because in that moment, you're going to slip into into your primordial innocence, the innocence with which we were born, that primordial wish. So connecting to the wish to be loved actually opens the door to self-compassion. More specifically, it opens the door to innocence, which in turn opens the door to self-compassion. The next step is to give ourselves the compassion that we need, especially in a moment of shame, which is the trickiest of all situations to receive compassion. So what I'd like to do now is to lead you in a brief exercise called the self-compassion break for shame. And it's based on the three components of self-compassion: mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness, in that order. Before we do this exercise, please ask yourself if this is a good time to touch shame in your life. So maybe your cup is full. Maybe you've heard a lot already and you need to digest what you've already heard. Or maybe you're going through some stress in your life and you actually don't need this right now, this exercise. So please take really good care of yourself. You can always listen to this recording at another time. And if you decide to go ahead with this practice, please know that you can also disengage, stop the practice anytime you like. So please take good care of yourself in this exercise. That too is self-compassion. So if you'd like to do this, please find a comfortable position. You can do it sitting. You can do it lying down. And then gently close your eyes. And I'd like you to think of an event in your life, past or present, that makes you feel embarrassed or somewhat ashamed. That is to say, about a 3 on a scale of 1 to 10. So, for example, maybe you feel ashamed that you haven't returned a friend's phone call for over a year now. Or maybe someone at work is more successful than you and makes you feel less than. Or maybe you don't have enough money to do fun things with your friends and feel embarrassed when you have to say no. Or maybe you're getting a divorce and you think it reflects badly on you. So please think of an event that's kind of mild to moderately embarrassing, somewhat shameful, but not anything traumatizing, because this exercise won't work. the first time you do it. Something mild. And also let it be an event that you would prefer not to share with others. And of course, you don't have to, because you imagine that someone would think less of you if they knew about it or thought about it. And if you go from a 3, again, you want this to be about a 3 on a scale of 1 to 10. If you go from a 3 to a 10 in intensity during the exercise, which can happen, then please just go ahead and let go of the exercise. Just disengage from the instructions. You can always come back to this later, okay? So with your eyes closed partially or fully is probably a little better if you can do it. Please allow yourself to, in your mind, to return to this situation. And recall how it feels, if it's a present situation, or how it felt at the time, if it's a past situation. See if you can visualize the situation, the people there, any words that were shared, but most importantly, how it felt in your body at that moment. This is a mindfulness practice. So this takes some courage. Nobody wants to feel shame, but it's also liberating to be able to say, oh, this is what shame feels like. This is shame. So right now, validating for yourself the experience of shame. Just saying silently to yourself, oh, shame. This is shame. This is how shame feels. And doing it in a kind way, as you would for a friend. Oh, you're feeling shame. And now seeing if you can discover where in your body you feel shame the most. Is it in your head, your neck, your chest, gut? And also allowing the experience to be there just as it is. Perhaps making a little more room than usual for the experience of shame in your body. So that's mindfulness. And the reason we're making a little more room for it is because shame is part of the human experience. So this is common humanity. Right now, just reminding yourself that what you're feeling is part of the human experience. Everyone feels shame. And not only that, most anybody in the same situation as you would probably feel shame as well. And in fact, probably at least large percentage of people watching this particular video right now have a similar experience. So in this feeling of shame, you are not alone. You may be feeling isolated and alone. That's the nature of shame, but you are not alone. Shame is a universal emotion. So allowing yourself to feel this, knowing that this is a universal emotion. And while you're feeling it, I would like you to consider for a moment that you only feel like this because you, like everyone else on this planet, just wants to be loved or just wants to be appreciated, to be respected, to belong. That shame happens. We worry about whether we're accepted or whether we fit in or whether we're liked or loved. We worry because this is so important to us. This wish springs eternal. Can you feel it springing eternally in you? Can you feel how this energy, this wish to be loved, is what leads to this worry, this concern, this shame? Can you allow yourself to drop deeply into that innocent wish? Perhaps just saying, yes, I, like every living being, just want to be loved, want to be appreciated, want to belong. Can you give yourself permission to connect with that universal wish? And as you do that, what happens to your shame? Stay with the wish, that tender, vulnerable yearning in us all. And now let's see if we can respond to shame in a new way. So, beginning to give yourself kindness simply because you feel this kind of distress, as we all do. So, what you can do if you like is you can go ahead and put a hand on the part of your body that feels shame. Yeah, if you like, if it's comfortable. Could be your face, your neck, your chest, your belly. And just feel the warmth of your hand if it's warm, or definitely the gentle touch. Even if you even wish, you can, if you wish, you can even gently rub that part of your body. Just taking it in. Another thing you can do is bring to mind a really compassionate being in your life. It could be a dog, it could be a grandparent, it could be a friend. And I'd like you to visualize their eyes and their face gazing at you in a compassionate way. And just allow yourself to bathe in that gaze. And finally, are there any words that you would love to hear or would have really, or need to hear, or would have needed to hear at the time that you were feeling like this? So if somebody, came into the room and just whispered in your ear something that felt just right to you, what would that have been? Words like, oh, I feel for you, I'm here for you, I believe in you, I trust you, you're a good person, I love you. What words would be like honey, nectar, medicine in that moment? And now, if you like, offering those words to yourself. saying those words over and over again in a gentle way. Now putting it all together, just noticing how that the hand feels on your body, visualizing compassionate eyes, and offering yourself these kind words. This is all the self-kindness component of self-compassion. Okay, so now I'd like you please to release this whole practice and just allow yourself to rest in your own experience, knowing, just let it go, let yourself rest, knowing that you can return to this practice anytime you like, especially in a moment of shame. You can name shame. This is shame. Feel it in your body, make some room for it. Remind yourself you're not alone. Connect with the universal wish to be loved. And then you can be kind to yourself in some way. So before you open your eyes, just allowing the whole experience to settle. Allowing this exercise for you to have been just as it was. And if for only one moment, for this moment, allowing yourself to be just as you are, just like this. And then when you're ready to slowly open your eyes, so I want to thank you. Thank you for listening to this talk. Thank you for participating in this exercise. So we have gone where angels fear to tread, you know. Shame is the most difficult human emotion, but we can go there with mindfulness and with self-compassion. If there's any residue from this exercise that continues to linger after a while, please take really good care of yourself in some behavioral way, some way that's familiar to you. Drinking a cup of tea, taking a warm bath, listening to music. Just taking really good care of yourself. That too is self-compassion. So I'd like to thank you for listening to this Wisdom for Life series on mindfulness and compassion. Perhaps two of the most important inner resources that we could ever learn. Thank you so much.